Hey everybody, Dr. Jason with HBOT USA. Thanks for joining us. I'm still here in Key Largo, Florida with Dick Rutkowski. I've been taking his class all week. This is Hyperbaric International. This is his company, his teaching grounds. He's been doing this for a long time. So I want to introduce Dick, and we're going to get a little bit to know him a little. So, Dick, can you just tell us a little bit of your history, where you've been and what you've been working on?
Well, starting from 1950 up until the present day, I joined the Navy in 1950. I spent 7.5 years in the Navy. Back in the 50s and so on, of course, there was no communications and things like there are today. So most of it was just Morse code and teletype. Worked as a Navy technician. When I got out of the Navy, I went into polar operations, and I spent 2.5 years in Antarctica, and I spent over 2 years. These were one-year increments in the Canadian Arctic Northwest Territories. I've been on both geographical poles and have a glacier named after me in Antarctica. Then when I got out of there, I went to work for Environmental Science Services Administration, and a lot of the scientists were working off of ships, and they had very little knowledge of diving back in those days, so I was sent to commercial diving school in '67 or so, and coming back, I then started teaching scientists from all other government agencies diving, and from there, the acronym NOAA started in about 1970. I was already part of ESSA, which became NOAA in 1970. So that was then the deputy director of the NOAA diving, director of NOAA diver training, director of the NOAA Miami Hyperbaric Chamber facility, and of course on the NOAA Diving Safety Board. Been pretty much involved with all aspects of the undersea world, with gases and life support systems, and then I started being in demand, traveling around the world, teaching people how to use chambers and passing on some of my knowledge I've learned at the NOAA Chamber, treating many, many divers. Overall, I had 5 hyperbaric facilities that I was responsible for, 4 of them being my own. We've treated between them, we treated over 1,000 divers. Many of these divers required many extra treatments. So we started the NOAA Physicians course, Dr. Wells and myself, back in 1975. I was co-director of the 3-week course, NOAA Diving Medical Officers course, which I later became then the co-director for 33 years with that course, from 75 to 2008. And in 85 I retired from the government, and I started forming the company called Hyperbarics International. And of course I started about 10 other little companies I bought and sold, and from then on life just kept growing and eventually getting more and more into the clinical aspects of not only diving but the use of recompression chambers for a lot of everyday medical clinical problems.
Yeah, so I mean, this has been, I've been here for 5 days now, taking the course with Dick, and I have to say, Dick, I've taken a lot of classes on hyperbaric. I've learned a lot in this course, things that I've really, either I knew of on the surface, but never really this level of depth, or even quite a few things that I've never even learned before yet.
Yep, yeah.
So I do appreciate that.
Oh, good, good.
So tell me, in your opinion, what are a handful of conditions that respond really well to hyperbaric therapy that people don't typically think of when they think of hyperbarics?
I can just about say mostly all problems that are not getting the sufficient oxygen supply and so on.
So anything ischemic?
Yeah, when we give oxygen, it speeds up the supply of oxygen to the injured or the diseased or the infection areas, reduces swelling, pressure, repair of injuries, enhances improvement of balance, coordination, bladder and bowel and bladder functions and so on. it just goes on and on. But the big thing now, of course, the big money maker is the treating of diabetic ulcers, non-healing wounds. But it's very beneficial at TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, all kind of brain hypoxia, near drowning for CP, palsy, all those things for younger children and so on, born with birth defects and so on.
Now, what's your theory about how oxygen specifically relates back to DNA and DNA replication?
Yeah. Well, at the age of 40, we begin to outlive the design spec of our core organs of the body. Advanced age is also a significant factor in inhibiting tissue repair. Once you get over 60, the inflammatory response is decreased in the rate of the DNA replication. If the DNA is not replicating, the cells are not going to be replicating. They're going to start to go dormant, and as they go dormant, they're going to start to lose their longevity for the cells themselves, which can eventually, if the DNA is not functioning properly and not replicating, to be able to get the cells to become active and dividing. Many different things can happen in terms of not only cellular longevity, but human life longevity itself.
And so you were also talking about how that affects the cellular energy of the cell, right?
Yes. Normally, the body get their energy from ATPs, which you don't want to get too technical, but the cells will have energy, but the cells are not going to replicate or become active in dividing until they actually give oxygen to the nuclear portion of the DNA so that the DNA can replicate itself. Everything in hyperbaric starts at the DNA level, and people are just beginning to learn that. So once the DNA replicates, then the cells can replicate, then the cells can go on to produce osteoblasts, collagen, fibroblasts, or angiogenesis. Osteo is the smallest buds of bone, fibroblast is the smallest buds of tissue. Angiogenesis is building arcades of, actually can build arcades of blood vessels to help enhance healing, wounding, or taking care of diseases, infections. There's so many things. I could sit here and talk all day about little things.
We did. We talked about it for 5 days, right?
Yeah.
So let me ask you one more question. You've been involved with hyperbaric medicine since really the beginning of what we understand, today's hyperbaric medicine to be. Where do you see hyperbaric medicine going in the future?
Well, it's really growing in leaps and bounds. See, originally, most of this stuff started off with the diving industry. It wasn't until 1964 that clinical hyperbaric, or the use of chambers, got started here in the United States. But even then, people were very skeptical of it because of the history of hyperbarics from the 1600s up until the 50s. In the 50s, over in Denmark, they started doing more research with it. And finally, about 1964, the use of chambers for clinical hyperbaric medicine came to the United States. But it wasn't really until 1974 that it was starting to get any viability. The Air Force was directed by DOE to look into hyperbarics for the military wounds and different things. So it was the Air Force that began to give clinical hyperbaric medicine its viability to get started. And that was about 1974. So it's been growing in leaps and bounds ever since, and as we get more and more individuals trained in the use and the benefit of it, there's just so many people that are suffering needlessly and taking all other kind of stuff when really it's the DNA. If it's not working, you're not going to have results. It's going to lower individual life longevity and so on.
Now, would you say that you've seen a trend from, everybody wanting to have really deep dives, high pressure dives, to something that's a little bit more in terms of moderate, in terms of pressure and oxygen, and now moving into even more mild pressures and even surface oxygen. All of these things, would you say, have a benefit, provided that you're getting oxygen into the cell?
Yeah, well, most people think that it's oxygen and pressure. It's not really oxygen and pressure, it's oxygen and time. I can give you just as many millimeters of mercury of oxygen at the surface, but it's going to take a longer time. Oxygen and pressure is more critical for acute things such as gangrene, CO coma, and embolisms. But a lot of the other medical problems, you put people in the chamber, it's really oxygen and time. And we're not working as deep in chambers as we used to. People are working shallower and shallower. And eventually I see the day when you probably will not even use chambers for a lot of the mild clinical stuff. And I'm already running a program now. It's a one-day course teaching people how to use surface oxygen and the benefits they can gain from using surface oxygen. If you look at me, I'm 89 years old. I use a little surface oxygen almost daily. Not much, but just enough to keep the DNA active.
That's great. Listen, man, I hope when I'm 89 that I'm still running around the way you are and standing in front of groups of people, teaching classes for 8 hours a day. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your class and your willingness to share all of your experience with.
Well, I hope this is satisfactory. I'm not a very good public
perfect. No,
public speaker,
it's been
but
great. Thanks so much.
Okay.